before we jump into 14 through 20, I want to talk about this because if you've read along in your Bible, you may have noticed this. There is some conversation here about Mark 16, verses 9 through 20, and about whether or not they actually belong in the Bible, right? So there is a conversation that, these verses were not included in the earliest manuscripts we have. So the oldest that we have to date are from 325 and 340, and they do not include these texts. They don't have 9 through 20. So some people will note that the writing style kind of sounds different. And if you as we get through this, the way the first part is written to how it changes there in verse 9, where he's recounting what happens to Mary, it is now suddenly stylistically it's slightly different, right?
Yeah.
Or so you could say. And many contemporary scholars say that reject that these were authentically in Mark's original letter, but that they were potentially added later, right? But there's some other conversation around there, and this is why it's still there, right? Is because there's reasonable belief as to why it should be there. Yeah. First of all, it corroborates some of what the other Gospels have said, so we know it's not telling us anything untrue. But Mark 16:18 is referenced by Papias, who wrote about it around 100 AD. Right? So as I mentioned, the oldest manuscripts we have is 325 and 340, and it doesn't have verse 18 in it, but Papias quotes verse 18 in 100 AD. So that lends itself to the idea that this was a part of the original manuscript.
Yeah.
Justin Martyr quotes Mark 16:20 and 151 AD. Irenaeus quotes Mark 16:13 and 180 AD. Hippolytus quotes Mark 16:18 through 19 between the years of 190 and 227 AD. So while the oldest manuscripts we have don't have these verses, we see reference to these verses before those manuscripts. And in addition to that, the overwhelming majority of manuscripts we have of the book of Mark do include these passages. Yeah. So traditionally, this is seen as canon.
Yeah.
Now how they got there, where they got there, there's a conversation that could be had.
Sure.
But there's more than enough evidence to suggest that these verses existed in the 2nd century, right?
Right.
So,
yeah, and I mean, at the end of the day, even if they didn't, there's still 3 other accounts that all say the same thing,
right?
So yeah. No, go ahead.
No, but I think it's important for us to note this because some people will look at this type of thing and say, "Well, see, we can't rely on it." But again, you have to understand how textual criticism is done and how a scholar is going to look at these.
Yeah.
There's nothing here that discredits any of what's happening.
Right.
Right.
Maybe he just ran out of paper.
Yeah, right. Well,
or ran out of ink.
There actually was a suggestion that because if he had ended it in verse 8, look at how abrupt it was.
Right. Yeah, no kidding. Trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid.
Yeah. So it's been,
so there's no ending. Well, what happened to Jesus? Where did he go?
What happened there? So it has been suggested that that's why the reason it's not in those manuscripts is that at some point it got ripped off.
Okay.
Right. So some manuscripts didn't have it because they were copying one that got ripped.
Yeah.
As opposed to one that hadn't.
Sure.
So there's that. So I didn't want to let that go by without at least addressing that conversation.
Yeah, for sure.